Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is James Kirikoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 6 running back rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, of course, we're talking about all things related to the running back position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses thus far this season, on average, have been giving up the most points to opposing running backs in a half PPR scoring format. Again, on today's video, everything we talk about is going to be in a half PPR sense, meaning everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard or full PPR. After we talk about matchups, giving you guys an idea as to who has the most advantageous or perhaps the most disadvantageous matchups going into the week and how that is potentially going to affect a running back's upside, we'll talk about my top 36 running back rankings, as I'll go ahead and share with you guys my perspective and opinions and the statistics that justify as to why I think the running back position is going to stack up as such going into Week 6. Again, before we begin today's video, I want to thank you guys for the incredible support. We are on our way to 54,000 subscribers. That is our next objective and goal. So if you're new to the channel and you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe. We're making fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2021 season, whether it is rankings, videos, waiver wires. Again, if you haven't checked out the waiver wire episode from yesterday, it's very important because there's a lot of running backs and players in general that have been hit with injuries. The injury bug is relentless and it is unbiased, and we of course need to go ahead and recoup value in order to give us our best chance of winning in the coming weeks, because of course there's a lot of bye weeks ahead of us. So check that out. Outside of the rankings videos, the waiver wires, the live streams, of course Sunday morning 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, hidden gems, rest of season, strength of schedule, all of this kind of stuff, trade targets. This is the channel to do it because we are here to try to help you win a 2021 fantasy football championship. Again, subscribe. Thank you very much. For those of you who continue to support with your viewership, smashing the like button, commenting down below, I cannot thank you guys enough. Thank you. All right, also, before we begin, Underdog Fantasy. For those of you who haven't checked it out, I did talk about it yesterday, and I have been talking about it for a while here. Again, it's another way to play fantasy football for those of you who are interested. Perhaps you didn't, draft enough teams. No problem. Underdog Fantasy can help you draft, resurrection best ball leagues from week 6 through 17. Whoever scores the most points wins it all. Again, there's other things like the pick'ems, the Thursday night, the Monday night rumbles, all these kind of contests to help you have, more fun in regards to fantasy football. There's a reason why there's a nail biter last night, despite the fact that it was an incredible game between the Baltimore Ravens and Indianapolis Colts. When you have something on the line and you have some skin in the game, regardless of whether your fantasy team is benefiting or, getting hurt by it, because again, the opponents you played in that specific week, there's another way to have another exciting performance. And of course, enjoy fantasy football, which we all want to do, because despite what you think, the fantasy football season is starting to move, and it's moving relatively quickly. And before you know it, it'll be gone. So take advantage of every fantasy opportunity you have. Underdog Fantasy. If you sign up now, promo code Andrew with your first deposit of $10 or more, you'll get an additional bonus cash of $10. Again, that's promo code Andrew. Description has all the information, so scroll down there and check it out. Thank you very much. Also, down in the description, we have timestamps for those of you interested. All right, let's talk about our Week 6 running backs, beginning with matchups. Again, we always talk about this, giving you guys some perspective as to how many points defenses are giving up to opposing running backs thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format. As you can see to the very left, 2021 running back fantasy points allowed, as it's titled, we see that the New York Giants thus far this season, for the first 5 weeks of the 2021 season, have been giving up the most points on average to opposing running backs, 35.95 per week, in comparison to a team like the Buffalo Bills or Carolina Panthers that are giving up the fewest points to opposing running backs, only 14 fantasy points to respective running backs per week. Though that is still enough points to sustain a running back in a given week, this is an average across the board, just kind of taking it into perspective. Of course, we want to go ahead and take advantage of these teams that are giving up so many points to opposing running backs. The Jets, Chargers, Lions, Dolphins, Jaguars. These are teams that every single week we should be playing our respective running backs against. But do not forget, this upcoming week, we do have 4 teams on bye, which will include the Jets, the Falcons, the Saints, and of course the 49ers. So we're not going to be able to take advantage of those matchups this week. But for running backs like Latavius Murray playing against the Chargers, or perhaps Joe Mixon against the Lions, or perhaps we're going to have a little bit of a London game between the Miami Dolphins and, of course, the Jacksonville Jaguars. There's a lot of fun to be had there for James Robinson and or maybe Myles Gaskin. He had a little bit of a breakout game this last week. Hopefully that is going to continue. Regardless, on the other side, we see 2021 running back rushing stats allowed. This pretty much isolates just rushing yards and rushing touchdowns, giving you perspective as to who's giving up the most points on the ground, because oftentimes it doesn't matter whether a defense is prone to giving up points through the air to opposing running backs. It mainly has to do with whether or not your respective team schematically is going to be targeting a respective running back. So with that being said, the Los Angeles Chargers, Jacksonville Jaguars, Miami Dolphins, Detroit Lions, the New York Jets, Minnesota Vikings, a lot of the teams that are on the left are giving up the most points on the ground. It should not be a surprise in any sort of capacity. Just giving you guys some perspective. While on the other side, you see that the Buffalo Bills are only giving up 6.23 points per week on the ground. I think Derrick Henry is going to have a lot to say about that, but nonetheless, we kind of take this in perspective. A couple of the other stats that I wanted to mention. As of this current moment in time, the Detroit Lions have given up 10 touchdowns to opposing running backs. The next highest would be, of course, the Jaguars and the Chargers with 9 apiece, whether it's on the ground or through the air. Of course, the Washington football team, they've given up 6 receiving touchdowns this season. 3 of them, of course, coming from Cordarrelle Patterson. He is a running back in some specific, specifically like Yahoo, he is considered a running back, and that's why he has to be included in these statistics. As for the teams that have given up little to no overall touchdowns, the Pittsburgh Steelers, a goose egg. They have not given up a single touchdown to opposing running backs this season, while teams like the Arizona Cardinals, Carolina Panthers, Buffalo Bills have only given up 1. These are our Week 6 matchups for the running back position, giving you guys some perspective and hopefully giving you guys a little bit more knowledge so that when, in fact, you make your decision as to who you're going to play this week, it'll be at a far more advantageous position, similar to some of these running backs in their matchups. I love that word. All right, we're going to go ahead and move on. Let's begin by talking about the running back position as a whole and my top 36 running back rankings. Again, a lot of the players that I mentioned today are automatic starts. It doesn't really even matter between a guy being at number 1 or number 8. They're all starting in your leagues unless you're playing in a league where it has, 8 to 6 teams in which you have all these stud running backs. And even in those scenarios, sure, we can kind of, split hairs, but ultimately we're starting all these studs. Do not forget, rankings are always subject to change, as they say it on screen in every single one of my rankings videos, because the end-all be-all is not today. Recording this on Tuesday, there's a lot that is potentially going to be changed by Sunday. So do not forget, there's a reason why I go ahead and I do live streams throughout the week, specifically on Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Kick off with Kurikoff. We're going to go ahead. We're going to talk about the running back position, and all positions will be updated there, helping you set your lineups and win our Week 6 contests. All right, let's get into this. I'm excited, and it's mainly because I got a lot to say about some of these running backs, because the majority of the guys that I'm going to talk about in this top 12 to 15 category had monster weeks in Week 5, and it's just exciting to see our studs produce. Nonetheless, we're going to move on, and we're going to talk about our number 1 running back on the week. The running back that is currently the number 1 in the National Football League, it is Derrick Henry. Coming off another incredible week, 31 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. He has been unbelievable. And despite the fact that he's playing against the second toughest matchup at the running back position, the Buffalo Bills, that have given up little to no points to opposing running backs, mainly has to do with the fact that, again, they have had a very soft strength of schedule in terms of playing against the Miami Dolphins week 2, the Houston Texans. CEH went down with an injury. They've had a softer schedule in terms of the running back position. But regardless of all of that, Derrick Henry is going to be able to impose his will, and I expect him to do so. Last season when he played against the Buffalo Bills defense, it was a little bit of a different defense, but nonetheless, 19 carries, 57 yards, 2 touchdowns, 3 yard per carry average. That's pretty much similar to what exactly the Buffalo Bills have been giving up this season. But as many of us have already seen, the Buffalo Bills are a little bit finer tuned than they were last year. With that even being said, Derrick Henry is a stud running back. He's had 4 consecutive 100-yard rushing games. At this current moment in time, he's touched the ball 156 times this season. He is on pace for touching the ball during the regular season 530 times. Is that pace going to continue? I don't know. But regardless of it, the offensive line is moving bodies. Derrick Henry is running over anybody that's not moving, and they're scoring points on the ground. The guy is touching the ball 30 times a game. Can he sustain it? If anybody was going to be able to do so, it's Derrick Henry. He's built for it. All right, Derrick Henry's our number 1. We're going to move on because it's going to take a lot to dethrone him because he is King Henry. All right, we're going to move on to Christian McCaffrey as our number 2. I do anticipate Christian McCaffrey playing this week because he did practice all of last week. Obviously wasn't given the thumbs up by Matt Rule, the head coach of the Carolina Panthers, but we're not concerned about it. We anticipate him playing, and if and when he does, he's going to find a lot of success this week against the Minnesota Vikings defense. Again, a defense that last year struggled heavily in terms of stopping the run and have done so as well this season, giving up the 12th most points to opposing running backs. As of thus far this season, when I look at some of the last couple matchups that they've played against, we go back to last week. We obviously saw DeAndre Swift had himself a great performance in weeks prior. Of course, Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt, combined for 169 total rushing yards. Joe Mixon, 127 and a touchdown earlier this season. All in all, Christian McCaffrey in the 2 games that he played in full this season has averaged about 22.5 carries, 85 rushing yards on average, about a half of rushing touchdown per game, 7 receptions, 77 receiving yards, and 22.7 fantasy points per game. That's his average across the board in the first 2 games that he played. In the last couple weeks, we've even seen guys like Hubbard in this backfield produce extremely well, specifically last week against Philadelphia, 101 rushing yards, 5 catches, 33 yards. We know Christian McCaffrey is significantly better in terms of talent overall. He's going to come in, plug in, and play a great matchup and definitely feast, and may end up being the number 1 on this given week if he's fully healthy and given the full opportunity. Moving on to Dalvin Cook. Speaking of fully healthy, this is another running back that should always be in the top 3 conversation of the position, but unfortunately, as of late, has been dealing with a high ankle sprain, which of course has had him very underutilized and or at times out in specific games. He came off that Arizona Cardinals game producing great numbers, but of course the next week obviously didn't do anything. This last week was ruled completely out. Alexander Mattison in his stead has been an unbelievable running back. Just to give you some perspective as to what Alexander Mattison has done in the 2 games that he's had a full reign of this backfield. 26 carries, 25 carries. 112 rushing yards, 113 rushing yards. Averaged about 4.4 yards per carry. Has had in the last 2 games at least 6 or 7 receptions, 40 to 59 rushing yards, and 20 plus fantasy points in both contests. Now, when we think about Alexander Mattison, then think about, of course, Dalvin Cook. We obviously come to the conclusion that Dalvin Cook is a far more talented running back, and we've obviously seen that this season. And obviously, Mattison has benefited from the fact that they've played against far easier matchups than Dalvin Cook saw earlier in the season. With that all said, if Dalvin Cook is healthy and ready to go, he is one of the top 2 or 3 running backs in fantasy football on a weekly basis, and that is why we go ahead and throw him in this conversation. If in fact we see a situation in which he's not going to play again, of course we're going to have Alexander Mattison in the top 12, maybe even in the top 10 once again for a 3rd consecutive week, in which of course he's being highly utilized and finding a lot of potential upside in his respective offense. All right, we move on to our number 4, Austin Ekeler. Austin Ekeler is currently the number 2 overall running back in fantasy football, specifically in a half PPR scoring format. He's been unbelievable. I mean, he was so good this last week. I mean, 30.4 fantasy points is incredible. In the last, 5 weeks, he's either been, when healthy, of course, I don't expect to qualify week 1 as a healthy week per se, though he was able to get over 10 fantasy points. Week 2 and 3 pretty much give us an idea as to what a healthy average Austin Ekeler is, about 19 fantasy points. And in the last 2 weeks of football have been, okay, what does a healthy Austin Ekeler with upside look like? And it's been about 29 fantasy points per game. So that 10-point gap is unbelievable, but nonetheless, we're talking about one of the best running backs in fantasy football right now. In fact, the 2nd best. And even last week, when everything was kind of looking like, oh, the Chargers are going to kick the ball and end the game, the defense, the Cleveland Browns, I want to thank them personally for grabbing Austin Ekeler and pulling him into the end zone to give us an extra rushing touchdown because they wanted to get the ball back to, of course, give their offense an opportunity at winning that game. Nonetheless, thank you, Cleveland Browns defense. But of course, thank you, Austin Ekeler, for being a stud. You get to play against the Baltimore Ravens this week, giving up the 6th most points to opposing running backs. Last night, during the Monday Night Football game, we saw Jonathan Taylor score 2 touchdowns, 1 on the ground, 1 through the air. We saw a little bit of Marlon Mack tearing them up a little bit. This is going to be an AFC showdown. A 4-1 versus a 4-1 team. Very exciting. I think Austin Ekeler's ready for the challenge ahead, and he's definitely going to be able to deliver for us once again. We move on to Ezekiel Elliott, our number 5. Zeke has been incredible. Of course, a lot of people were worried about that week 1 performance. But I mean, Zeke is the number 3 overall back in fantasy football. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we haven't seen Christian McCaffrey here. There hasn't been a full healthy Dalvin Cook. And I understand that. But nonetheless, Zeke is coming off of back-to-back 100-yard rushing games. The last time he did that, 2019, 2018, he looks like the Zeke of the first 3 seasons of his NFL career. It really does. And we're getting to the point that everybody has to respect it. Again, I've been banging the table for Ezekiel Elliott all season and even into the offseason because I knew with Dak Prescott in a fully healthy offensive line, and my goodness, has this offensive line been the best in the National Football League, even without their starting right tackle La'el Collins, who should be returning this week or next week because, again, he was suspended for the drug test and all that kind of jazz. But nonetheless, Ezekiel Elliott has been unstoppable. 20-plus fantasy points in 3 consecutive weeks. I mean, he scored 6 touchdowns in the last 4 weeks. I mean, that's not normal for Zeke. Yes, this is Zeke numbers from like 2016. It really is. And that is incredible. It's a little bit of a revitalization of his career, despite all the doubt and all the kind of hatred that he has gotten. In terms of fantasy, love to see it. Plays against the New England Patriots. I'm not worried about the matchup. He's getting the ball about 20-plus times a game. And even with Tony Pollard touching the ball 10 times a game, it does not impede in his overall upside. He's a stud play, and I expect him to play incredible this week against the New England Patriots. Jonathan Taylor is our number 6. Speaking of that Monday Night Football game a little bit earlier, my goodness, was he great. 30.4 fantasy points, 3 catches, 116 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown, 53 rushing yards, and a singular rushing touchdown on a total of 15 carries. At this current moment in time, even without his offensive line fully healthy, without Quentin Nelson, without the starting right tackle, they have still been able to put up great numbers. Last 2 weeks for Jonathan Taylor has been the revitalization of his 2021 season. A lot of people were doubting him early and often, but I went ahead and I stayed true with him, and he's going to continue to produce these numbers, mainly because he plays against the Houston Texans. And we know what the Houston Texans are. They're one of the easier matchups throughout the entire season. And when you play against the Indianapolis Colts, they typically have the Houston Texans number on the ground because they play against them twice a season. Now, last season when Jonathan Taylor had the privilege of playing against this defense, he was able to put up great numbers. The first time he played against them last season, 91 rushing yards, 3 catches on 3 targets for 44 receiving yards and a touchdown, 21 fantasy points. And in the second contest against them, 83 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, 4 catches, 12 yards, 17.5 fantasy points. He is again going to have great numbers against this Houston defense because they're giving up the 16th most points to opposing running backs. And in reality, even Damien Harris last week was supposed to score 2 touchdowns, but unfortunately, with 4 offensive linemen out, again, both the right tackle, right guard, and left tackle, left guard were out for the Patriots. And Damien Harris was running the ball like an absolute monster. Again, should have had 2 rushing touchdowns, should have had about 14 fantasy points, but nonetheless, I'm not worried about Jonathan Taylor. With all the circulating rumors about Marlon Mack potentially being traded, we're going to, of course, continue to ride out Jonathan Taylor as he's a stud back. Najee Harris is our number 7. My goodness, is it exciting to... Last week, at this time last week, we literally were saying, oh, Najee Harris, 62 rushing yards. That's his career high, great numbers. And then it was like, you know what, Andrew, hold my beer. I'm going to double that up for 122 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. Oh my goodness, was that exciting to see. Ultimately, Najee Harris has one of the best matchups on the week. Playing against the Seattle Seahawks defense, I mean, just going over the matchups and specifically running backs tearing them apart this season. Derrick Henry, 182 and 3 touchdowns. Madison, 26 total rushing attempts for 112. Obviously had 7 catches in the passing game for 40-plus yards. We obviously saw Sermon, 19 carries, 89 yards. And then the Rams duo of Hendo and Sony Michel go for 28 carries, 119 yards, and 2 rushing touchdowns last week. I mean, Najee Harris, week in and week out, is getting better and better. And the ground game and the offense looked significantly better for the Steelers. I think this matchup, especially with Seattle not having their stud quarterback there, it's going to be a lot of 3-and-out scenarios, in my opinion, because it's going to be hard for them to run the ball. And it's going to lead to, of course, the Steelers leading, running the ball, and letting Najee Harris dictate the game. James Robinson is our number 8. I mean, James Robinson, here's my question. Why did the Jaguars draft Travis Etienne? In reality, I understand, okay, maybe you want to go ahead, you get another player that's very familiar with Trevor Lawrence, a former teammate of his at Clemson. I understand that prospect, but a first-round pick on a running back when you already had James Robinson, I'm glad James Robinson is doing this because he deserves to be the starter of this team for years to come. In only his second year, he is a solidified RB1. He obviously proved it last year, but 3 consecutive weeks of over 20 fantasy points. Obviously, he's continuing to solidify that. He's coming off of a week of 149 rushing yards and 8.3 yards per carry against the Tennessee Titans defense. Unbelievable numbers. And this week, he gets to play against the Miami Dolphins. In my opinion, one of, if not the best matchup this week. Damien Harris went for 100 on them in week 1. The Buffalo duo went for 100 yards and 3 touchdowns on the ground. Peyton Barber, 111 and a touchdown. Jonathan Taylor, 103 and a touchdown. And Leonard Fournette with a very poised game because, again, Tom Brady was going for 400 passing yards and 5 passing touchdowns. Fournette on an easy week, 67 yards and a rushing touchdown, 4 catches. He got his work on through the air, no problem. James Robinson is a stud running back. This offense is obviously going to run through him, because, of course, Trevor Lawrence is still figuring it out. And the Jacksonville Jaguars get to play in London. And we know the Jacksonville Jaguars feel a lot at home there, and it's kind of a home game. James Robinson is going to have a great week here. Nick Chubb is our number 9. Now, Nick Chubb, obviously he's one of the best running backs in the National Football League. If there wasn't a Kareem Hunt in this backfield, Nick Chubb would be the number 1 running back in fantasy football. And I 100%, without a doubt in my mind, believe that as a definitive statement. Now, with that said, he's still coming off a week in which he had 21 carries, 161 rushing yards and 7.7 yards per carry, and a rushing touchdown, 23.5 fantasy points against the Los Angeles Chargers' putrid run defense. Of course, we know the Chargers are one of the easiest teams to run on, and that's why Nick Chubb dominated against them. This upcoming week has to play against the Arizona Cardinals, and while everyone will be looking at Kyler versus Baker, former teammates at Oklahoma, and they'll be kind of picking apart that matchup, the running game is going to be the key to this entire team succeeding, and obviously, I think they very well could. Dalvin Cook, 131 on the ground against them. James Robinson, 88 and a touchdown. Henderson, a couple weeks back, 89 yards on the ground against this Arizona Cardinals defense. If it wasn't for Kareem Hunt stealing, 3 touchdowns between weeks 2 through 4, of course, Nick Chubb would be in the conversation of probably being a top 2 every single week in my rankings. But with the prospect of one of the most successful rushing offenses, and in fact, the current most successful rushing offense in the National Football League, as they are already run for 938 total rushing yards. In comparison to all other teams, they are by far and away the leader. And in terms of rushing touchdowns, they have 12 already. No one's even close to that number in terms of a backfield. I know Derrick Henry himself has himself, 7 rushing touchdowns this year. A lot of teams aren't even close to these numbers again. So just putting in perspective, if there wasn't a Kareem Hunt, Chubb would be way higher. I expect Kareem Hunt to also probably score 16 plus fantasy points while Nick Chubb does his damage. And that in itself, of course, leaves him at this current ranking. But again, an automatic start nonetheless. We move on to Joe Mixon. Joe Mixon was a guy that I looked at last week and I said, no one should probably be starting him because he was pretty much out the entire week for practice, didn't participate, was dealing with an ankle injury, and Samaje Perine looked like he was going to be the guy that led the backfield. And though they said on Sunday morning he's going to play, I thought to myself, he's definitely not going to be averaging his 22.5 carries, and he didn't. He only touched the ball 10 times on the ground for 33 yards, 3.3 yards per carry. That's Mixon numbers. That's not a surprise, but was lucky enough to fall into the end zone late in that game, get himself 10 fantasy points. With Samaje Perine being on the IR vid list, the question is, what exactly can we anticipate from Joe Mixon against the Detroit Lions, giving up the 3rd most points to opposing running backs and have given up the most touchdowns, 10, to opposing running backs this season? The Detroit Lions have given up a boatload of numbers. I mean, Elijah Mitchell, week 1, 104 yards and a touchdown. Aaron Jones, 115 all-purpose yards and 4 touchdowns. Montgomery and Damien Williams combined for 161 on the ground and 3 touchdowns. Madison, 113 rushing yards, 40 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. All in all, I think Joe Mixon's in a very advantageous position. And in fact, when we saw Samaje Perine, get himself 4 total receptions, 24 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown yesterday, and actually looked like a good running back against that Green Bay Packers team, it gave me even more confidence that this offense is going to continue to feed Joe Mixon now that Samaje Perine's out of the lineup. And of course, let him succeed against a very easy matchup in Detroit. All right, we're going to move on to Aaron Jones. Aaron Jones, in comparison to the rest of the field, had a little bit of an underwhelming performance this week, in my opinion. But nonetheless, we look at Aaron Jones and we think, okay, is he going to dominate against the Chicago Bears? Most likely. I mean, last season when he played against the Chicago Bears, 51 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, was able to get himself 16.5 fantasy points in the matchup. Great. Overall, fantastic. Now, in terms of running backs against this defense, has it been extremely easy? Definitely not. Henderson, 70 yards and a touchdown. Kareem Hunt absolutely dominated against them, and so did Nick Chubb. Josh Jacobs this last week, 48 rushing yards and a touchdown. I mean, Aaron Jones is coming off a week in which he had 14 carries for 103 rushing yards, 7.4 yards per carry, 4 catches for 6 receiving yards, only 12.9 half PPR fantasy points. He accompanies that performance with a touchdown. Again, he's a 19-point running back, and that's what we expect from Aaron Jones. But as much as we'd like to potentially see Aaron Jones dominating, A.J. Dillon is going to become a problem. A.J. Dillon is getting a lot of touches in the last 2 weeks. He's getting more and more work. And even with that, I'm not concerned, right? I'm still playing Aaron Jones. He's going to be a 19-point running back. He has that upside. Maybe even more because he's a touchdown fiend. But nonetheless, we have to always take into account that there are other mouths to feed in these respective backfields. And if, in fact, they're going to take touches, it is going to, in my opinion, lower the overall upside of a player. Nonetheless, Aaron Jones is a stud. Great matchup this week against Chicago against a division rival. That should be easy for them. DeAndre Swift is our number 12. I like DeAndre Swift a lot. I mean, he's had 3 weeks of 19-plus half PPR points this season. He's coming off another week in which he was averaging 4.6 yards per carry, had a rushing touchdown, 6 targets leading to 6 receptions and 53 rushing yards, regardless of game script. This is a man that is getting heavily utilized in the passing game, and that is completely unlocking his overall potential. Plays against Cincinnati, like I just mentioned. Aaron Jones just had a great week of 104 rushing yards against them, 103, rushing yards against them, and dominated. James Robinson, 78 yards, 2 rushing touchdowns. I think this is another primed and ready matchup, regardless of the game script, that DeAndre Swift is going to be able to succeed in. Again, let's just take into account, DeAndre Swift this season hasn't been fully healthy. Not even since week 1 has he been fully healthy. This last week, during practice, the practice report had him limited every single day of the week. Imagine when we get a healthy DeAndre Swift, what we're going to see in an Anthony Lynn ran offense. Like, the offensive coordinator is making him look like just a completely different running back than we saw last season, and I love it. And I cannot get enough of it. DeAndre Swift, a fantastic play, and should be another great one this week. We move on to the RB2 conversation. Though we have the RB2 quote-unquote conversation, Kareem Hunt deserves to be an RB1 in every single statistical category. Coming off another week in which he was hyper efficient with his 12 carries for 5.1 yards per carry, 2 rushing touchdowns, 5 catches on 6 targets, 23.4 fantasy points. Again, this is another week in which he almost outscored Nick Chubb. And every time they get down to the goal line, for some reason Nick Chubb's coming out of the game and Kareem Hunt's going in. And as long as that's going to be the case, Kareem Hunt being the number 5 overall running back in fantasy isn't going to be a surprise. He's going to continue this streak. And though they play against the Arizona Cardinals, like I mentioned in regards to Nick Chubb, we've seen many running backs, especially in the last couple weeks, produce well against this defense. Dalvin Cook, 131. Henderson, 89 rushing yards. James Robinson, 88 rushing yards and a touchdown. And the passing game will always be an opportunity for Kareem Hunt to get more upside. Again, I mentioned it earlier. In regards to what exactly this Cleveland Browns offense is, they're the most successful running game in the National Football League with a total of 938 rushing yards and 12 total rushing touchdowns on the season. This backfield is primed and ready for another great week. In comparison to all other running backs in the National Football League, I mean, it's insane to think about Kareem Hunt having tied for the second most in the NFL. Of course, Derrick Henry leads the entire pack with 7 rushing touchdowns, while Ezekiel Elliott, James Conner, and Kareem Hunt tied for number 2 with 5 total rushing touchdowns. He's going to continue to get the goal line carries. No one's going to be able to stop him. And with the amount of touches he's getting in an offense that's built to run the ball behind an incredible offensive line, Kareem Hunt's a stud. Antonio Gibson's on number 14. Gibby is in a very interesting scenario. Gibby thus far this season has played very similar snaps every single week, on average about 58.7% of the offensive snaps, because again, there is a lot of J.D. McKissic involvement. And though J.D. McKissic didn't get much of a total experience this last week, while of course Antonio Gibson, 22 total touches, 2 rushing touchdowns, 20.2 fantasy points. We love to see our studs produce. Despite all of that, I think Antonio Gibson is on track to potentially getting himself another great week against the Kansas City Chiefs that are giving up the 11th most points to opposing running backs. But there is a little bit of concern in regards to what exactly we're going to see. The Washington football team have given up the most points to opposing wide receivers this season. It's not even close. It really isn't even close. And we'll talk about that tomorrow. But I am very concerned of the possibility that Washington is giving up so many points and they personally, offensively, can't keep up with Patrick Mahomes and that offense. And if that's going to be the case, hopefully Antonio Gibson will be exposed and given more opportunity in the passing game. But if in fact he's not, then he's going to have a little bit of a cap ceiling. Of course, the rushing upside is going to be there. The touches are going to continue to get there. And of course, he has incredible value because he has an offense that is built around him. As long as he can continue to get the opportunity, this offense can at least score some points like Washington did against the Buffalo Bills defense. I think Antonio Gibson is in a very advantageous spot because a great matchup. Just going to be tough. I need to see him catch more than 2 balls this week for a good amount of yardage. Hopefully that's going to be the case. Darrell Henderson's our number 15. We love Darrell Henderson. He has just been gold this season. I mean, 10 plus points every single contest that he's played, coming off a 16.4 fantasy week in which he split carries almost down the middle with a Sony Michel. We certainly want to see Darrell Henderson get majority or the lion's share of the touches, but what are we going to do about it? Either way, the New York Giants, that's their matchup this week, giving up the 7th most points to running backs. Let's just talk about some of the matchups this season in which, of course, the Giants have been brutalized by running backs. Gordon in week 1, 101 rushing yards and a touchdown. Kamara, 120 rushing yards a couple weeks back. Zeke, 110 and a rushing touchdown. And Cordero Patterson against this defense went for 102 all-purpose yards. Darrell Henderson is getting opportunity. This offense has looked great. And as long as they continue to move bodies, Darrell Henderson is going to find lanes and find fantasy points for your team. He's a great play as my number 15 this week, automatic start. Moving on to Leonard Fournette as our number 16 overall running back. I love Leonard Fournette mainly because it looks like he has solidified himself as the through and through RB1, 2, 3 on this team. Yes, we will see a little bit of a sprinkle from Giovanni Bernard catching a couple passes here and there. We will see a little bit of a sprinkle of Ronald Jones. But ultimately, it is Leonard Fournette's backfield. And that is incredible. And that's exactly what I anticipated last season. But due to the injuries of Leonard Fournette, we saw a lot of Ronald Jones. Ronald Jones, I think, finished as the number 16 overall running back last season. And I think there's a very good chance whoever the starting running back of this team is could very easily finish there. And that's why we kind of have him in this range, because he's been producing in this range for the last couple weeks. He's coming off a performance of 19 fantasy points. Again, we anticipated that. 4 catches, 43 yards. He's a PPR fiend. Besides the fact that he's getting the carries on the ground, 12 carries, 67 yards, 5.6 yards per carry against Miami for a rushing touchdown, all while Tom Brady, had the best game of his career statistically. He has never gone for 5 passing touchdowns and 400 passing yards. As a 44-year-old man, that is unbelievable. And yet, Leonard Fournette's like, just a walk in the park, no problem. They play against Philadelphia on Thursday night. It's a short week. And of course, teams want to run the ball and bang bodies. And I think 100%, we're going to see a lot of production from a guy like Leonard Fournette. Hubbard's coming off a week in which he had 101 rushing yards against this Philadelphia defense. In the week prior, CEH went for 102 rushing yards and a receiving touchdown against them. Zeke went for 95 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns against them. Leonard Fournette, congratulations, another incredible play this week. We have Josh Jacobs as our number 17. Josh Jacobs, luckily, found the end zone last week. But the thing about Josh Jacobs that made me talk about him as a trade target last week specifically is because he's going to have more and more opportunity going in his direction. And we saw that based on the snap counts and the opportunity, of targets from Kenyon Drake that have relatively disappeared in the last couple weeks. Kenyon Drake has only seen 1 target in the last 2 weeks. And because of that, we've seen 9 total receptions from Josh Jacobs in the last 2 weeks. And that's pretty much been the entire rhetoric around whether or not Josh Jacobs is going to be a stud running back, RB1, or an RB2. All offseason, his entire career, that has been the talking points. Can he get the PPR work? Looks like he's going to get there. They play against the Denver Broncos. The Denver Broncos are one of the best run-stopping defenses this season, but we're coming off a week in which Najee Harris just went for 122 and a touchdown against them. And let's not forget, Josh Jacobs in his career, specifically last season, has dominated against the Denver Broncos. I mean, incredible numbers. In the first contest against them, 89 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns. The second contest against them, 112 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns. Denver Broncos is the matchup that he likes to play against. And of course, the Raiders need a little bit of a bounce back week with all that is happening in their organization. Of course, Josh Jacobs should be primed and ready for a lot of rushing attempts, hopefully some rushing touchdowns, and of course, those receptions going in his direction. We have Damien Williams as our number 18. Love to see where he ended up finishing this last week. Pretty much picking up where David Montgomery left off. David Montgomery is a guy that, was the number 11 running back. Obviously was a higher end RB2, lower end RB1. But Damien Williams, nonetheless, with splitting carries with Khalil Herbert. 16 carries, 64 yards, 4 yards per carry, a rushing touchdown on an incredible spin on the goal line to get into the end zone. 2 catches, 20 yards, 15.4 fantasy points. Takes on the Green Bay Packers. From what we just saw, Samaje Perine and Joe Mixon combined for, it was a total of 21 carries for 92 yards and 2 total touchdowns. Again, that's not even including the receiving work that Samaje Perine was able to put up, which was 4 catches for 24 yards. Again, I look at Damien Williams. Khalil Herbert was mainly used because they were running clock. And if, in fact, it's going to be a Damien Williams game in which they're having to come back the entire time, I think the Green Bay Packers have obviously been one of the teams in the last couple of years that have given up a lot of points to opposing running backs. Obviously, they haven't done that this season because of the matchups. They'll eventually be exposed, but hopefully the Chicago Bears are ready to go after this Green Bay defense. The last time we've seen David Montgomery play against this defense, he absolutely torched them for 20-plus points. Obviously, it's not the same talent, but it's the same opportunity that Damien Williams will have. Chase Edmonds is our number 19. Edmonds, prior to this last week, from weeks 1 through 4 of the fantasy football season, was 10-plus fantasy points. Consecutive weeks, incredible. Obviously dealt with a shoulder injury the entire week, was potentially not going to even play, was questionable the whole week, but he played nonetheless. And obviously, we played an injured running back, and many of us hurt ourselves with a 2.9 point performance from him. But nonetheless, if he is healthy and he fully practices this week, we know that James Conner is the goal line back, but we have to take into account this is a run defense that is very good, and it's going to force Kyler Murray to, of course, throw the ball. And we can't end up scoring 17 points against the 49ers and expect to do the same thing against the Cleveland Browns, who just put up 40-plus points themselves. I think this is a game in which Kyler's throwing a lot. Chase Edmonds is going to have to be a huge part of this offense. I know they were using a lot of Rondale Moore out of the backfield, whether it's carries, receptions, stuff like that. Chase Edmonds will get back into that role. Chase Edmonds didn't play less snap counts. He just didn't touch the ball as much. That may have been a game script thing, just kind of keeping the ball on the ground, killing clock. Either way, I think he'll get back to being that double-digit monster, especially with the receptions going in his direction in a very enticing matchup. We have Darrel Williams in this conversation as the number 20 overall back. Earlier today, we were given information in regards to Clyde Edwards-Helaire being put on the injured reserve. Now that he is going to be out for a minimum of 3 weeks, potentially even longer, depending on what the severity of that injury is going to be, grade 1, 2, maybe higher, with the MCL, whatever is going on with his meniscus, and whatever his knee is going to have to deal with. Darrel Williams is in a very advantageous spot. We've seen Darrel Williams be a great running back. Let's go back to the 2020 NFL playoffs. It was just this year in January in which he went for 13 carries, 78 rushing yards, 4 catches for 16 yards against the Cleveland Browns defense. And in the week following against the Buffalo Bills, 13 carries, 52 yards, a rushing touchdown, 1 catch for 9 yards. He can be an RB2, and that's what I anticipate. And that's why we want to pick him up via waivers, because he could be a very valuable asset for our team. Going into this upcoming week against the Washington football team, giving up the 13th most points to opposing running backs, specifically because Cordero Patterson's unbelievable bomb of a week. But nonetheless, they're giving up a lot of points to opposing running backs, whether it is on the ground or through the air. And I think as long as we're in a situation where we're looking at, okay, Alvin Kamara is coming off a week in which he even dominated against them, especially through the air. 5 catches, 51 and a touchdown, along with the 71 on the ground and a rushing touchdown. If the New Orleans Saints could just completely blow out that defense, and every team is pretty much blowing out that defense, regardless of who it is, even the Atlanta Falcons, for goodness sake, Darrel Williams is going to have the full backfield. Keep in mind, there is rumors that Marlon Mack could be traded to the Chiefs. If that's the case, then Clyde Edwards' injury is even more severe than we anticipate, or we've been, kind of led on to believe. But either way, Darrel Williams, a pretty solid RB2 start this week. Damien Harris. Damien Harris should have scored 2 touchdowns this last week. He literally plunges onto the goal line, fumbles before breaking the plane, and the Houston Texans recover. Obviously he was dealing with a rib injury / chest injury. He's currently day-to-day. But nonetheless, Damien Harris, in my opinion, going forward, is a pretty good option. But he plays against the Dallas Cowboys. They're giving up the 3rd fewest points to opposing running backs on the ground this season. That's just, rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. Last week, Damien Harris's right tackle, right guard, left tackle, left guard were out for the game. If we are going to once again see offensive linemen missing against Dallas's defense, it's not going to be as easy as when you play against the Houston Texans. Either way, Damien Harris has been given an opportunity, and if he's healthy for this week, I think he'll have a great game. End up finding the end zone potentially. We have Javonte Williams as our number 22. Now, Javonte Williams was hyper efficient against the Pittsburgh Steelers. 8 carries, 61 yards, 6.7 yards per carry, 3 catches on 3 targets, 25 receiving yards, and 10.1 fantasy points. This upcoming week, they play against the Las Vegas Raiders. And the Raiders defense, they're one of the worst on the ground, specifically because Austin Ekeler, 117 rushing yards, 1 rushing touchdown, 28 through the air, 1 receiving touchdown. The Baltimore Ravens in week 1, 93 on the ground, 2 touchdowns with just their running backs. The Chicago duo, just this last week, Khalil Herbert, Damien Williams, 139 on the ground and 1 rushing touchdown. The Las Vegas Raiders are in trouble because Javonte Williams is coming to town, and hopefully this could be the week that flips the entire narrative and gives Javonte Williams his backfield, or at least the advantage here, considering he's been out touching Melvin Gordon, or at least keeping pace in the last couple weeks, but of course being far more efficient as of late. We move on to Zack Moss. Man, Zack Moss is just, he's free points. It is really crazy, but he just is free points in fantasy football. He has been 10-plus points since week 2, and we absolutely love it. Obviously, he wasn't able to score a touchdown this last week, but they didn't need him to score a touchdown. Nonetheless, he plays against the Tennessee Titans, giving up the 18th most points to opposing running backs. May not be the most advantageous matchup, but of course, we just saw James Robinson go for 149 and a touchdown against them. Thus far this season, the Tennessee Titans have allowed 5 rushing touchdowns on the ground. I think this is a matchup in which Zack Moss, a guy that is probably going to be in a game script in which the Buffalo Bills are leading and pounding the rock in the second half against a very bad defense, is going to potentially find the end zone for himself. As long as he's getting the receiving work, out-touching Singletary, outplaying Singletary, he's for sure a top 23 back and my number 23 this week with great upside with the touchdowns. Number 24 is Myles Gaskin. Though Myles Gaskin hasn't been in this conversation since the early weeks, perhaps week 2 was the last time we mentioned him, I am hoping that not only the matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars, the 5th best in the National Football League right now, and his incredible performance of 10 targets, 10 catches, 74 yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns for 26.9 fantasy points is going to wake somebody up in this organization. Jacoby Brissett hurt himself. Tua has been designated to return this week in the matchup. And if they're going to run the ball, my goodness, they have to do it with Myles Gaskin. The guy's averaging 4.9 yards per carry. He's even better than he was last season. Get him involved in this offense. Of course, the Jacksonville Jaguars this season, everyone has torched them. We've seen Derrick Henry, 130 yards, 3 touchdowns. Joe Mixon, 67 and a touchdown. James Conner, 43, 2 touchdowns. The Denver Broncos, 95 total rushing yards. And Houston, 123 touchdowns in week 1. Myles Gaskin, just give him the opportunity and he will deliver. That's hopefully going to be the case this week. We move on to the RB3 conversation, beginning with Devontae Booker, as we're going to probably have Saquon Barkley out for a little while. Devontae Booker is going to have to recoup some value, and luckily Devontae Booker played a lot this last week and got a lot of opportunity and exposure, certainly delivered on it with 19.3 fantasy points, which is why we talked about him being a waiver wire pickup, because despite the fact that he plays against the Los Angeles Rams, the opportunity is going to be there. Now, of course, if Mike Glennon's the quarterback, we're going to be in a little bit of trouble, but hopefully Daniel Jones is there, and hopefully Devontae Booker is given very similar exposure to opportunity. 16 carries, 4 targets, 3 receptions. I mean, if you're going to get 19 carries, regardless of who you are in the National Football League, you're going to find fantasy success. Because, regardless of how inefficient you could possibly be, accuracy by volume. As long as you have the volume of opportunity, you are going to score points. And I think Devontae Booker obviously has proven in years past, whether it was with the Denver Broncos and or the Las Vegas Raiders, and even this season with the Giants, he can be a fill-in running back that could put up points. And he can hopefully do that this week against the Los Angeles Rams. Moving on to James Conner, our number 26. James Conner is number 2 in the National Football League in total running back touchdowns with 5. He is scoring week in and week out. Kyler Murray is no longer a goal line guy. And, this was the numbers that we were hopefully going to see Kenyon Drake do last year. But James Conner he's carved himself out a role that no one else is going to take from him. He's 10-plus points each of the last couple weeks, even more at times. And to be honest, even against the Cleveland Browns, I'm not worried about it. If Austin Ekeler is able to survive with over 3 yards per carry against them, I'm sure James Conner could do the same. They've got a pretty solidified offensive line. And all we're looking for Conner to do is score a touchdown. Because if he doesn't, he's 4 fantasy points. If he does, he's 10 or more. And that's all it is. He's pretty much the coin flip of a touchdown. But based on the rate in terms of this offense scoring and how well he has played, looks like it's more of a possibility than not. Melvin Gordon is our number 27 against the Las Vegas Raiders. In the same regard as I had Javonte Williams ranked relatively high this week, I think Melvin Gordon can very easily succeed himself. 9 total rushing attempts for 34 yards, 2 catches for 9 yards this last week, 5.3 fantasy points. Obviously, the Pittsburgh Steelers got to him, not to Javonte Williams. But nonetheless, the Las Vegas Raiders matchup is a very familiar one for Melvin Gordon. Whether it is his days with the Los Angeles Chargers or last year with the Denver Broncos, this is a matchup that everybody knows is an easy one. Nonetheless, Melvin Gordon should find success if given more than, 10 touches. Even with 10 touches, sure, he might be able to succeed, but this may be a game in which the Denver Broncos are leading by a significant margin, and if in fact that's the case and they can run the ball out, Melvin Gordon would find even more potential upside and success. But for right now, we have him here because I do expect potentially Javonte Williams to take that next step this week. We move on to Miles Sanders as our number 28. And you may be thinking, Andrew, how in the world are you going to have Miles Sanders as your number 28 overall running back, despite the fact that he has just been awful this season? And hear me out. I was going to have Miles Sanders as number 34, and I was going to bury him. But I want to put him over because I don't think he's that bad. I think he's one good performance away from everybody changing their mind once again. And from what we've seen from Miles Sanders' history, let's talk about this season alone. In 4 of the last 5 games that he's played, he's had a minimum of 3 receptions. That's great. We'll take those numbers. But the number that I like the most about Miles Sanders is that when I looked at him versus tough matchups last season, specifically playing against the New Orleans Saints and the Pittsburgh Steelers, those were 2 of his most effective games last season in terms of fantasy point productivity. Miles Sanders, for somehow, some way, shows up when he's not supposed to. And I think this is the week. When you play against Tampa Bay on a Thursday night, when everyone is counting you out, this might be a Miles Sanders week, guys. I mean, last season against New Orleans, when he had no business running the ball for 115 yards and 2 touchdowns, he did it anyway. When he played against Pittsburgh and had no business going for 80 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns, he did it anyway. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers are giving up points through the air. Again, Gaskin, 10 catches, 74 and 2 touchdowns. The New England backfield, through the air, 8 catches, 81 receiving yards. And even the Atlanta backfield, 12 catches, 83 yards and a touchdown. The receiving work is going to be everything. And sure, Kenneth Gainwell could siphon value. I think Miles Sanders is in a very advantageous spot and may end up shocking some people this week. Moving on to Tony Pollard, our number 29. Listen, I like Tony Pollard a lot. He's getting a good amount of touches. And with those opportunities, he's delivering. He's, as of this current moment in time, the number 1 overall graded running back in terms of running the ball, according to Pro Football Focus. The number 2, I think, is James Robinson. And then we start getting to the guys that are in like the top 12 category. Henrys and Chubb and all that kind of stuff. Nonetheless, he is hyper efficient with his opportunity. And if they were in an offense like the Cleveland Browns, he could be the Kareem Hunt of that offense, as long as he scored touchdowns. But luckily for Zeke owners, he is not stealing touchdowns just yet. He's coming off a week in which he had 5.4 yards per carry, 4 catches on 4 targets, plays against New England. The offense has the best offensive line in the league. They are running over everyone. And I don't think the New England defense is going to have much to say about it. New England, they themselves have struggled against running backs for quite some time, even going back to last season with all those holdouts. Nonetheless, Tony Pollard, a great option this week, will always have the upside of a rushing touchdown, which will take his game to the next level into the RB2 category. Moving on to Alex Collins at number 30. Alex Collins was given opportunity last week, and we can't really complain about that. 15 carries, 2 receptions, 17 total touches. Again, like I mentioned, regardless of which running back it is, regardless of the matchup, is effective. But they play against the Pittsburgh Steelers, and I've talked about it week in and week out. When you play against the Pittsburgh Steelers, it is not a fun category. I mean, ultimately, yes, there have been some running backs that succeed against this defense, and just as of late, honestly, there have been running backs that succeeded against this defense. But is it something that I'm 100% willing to buy in on when there's no Russell Wilson, when the offense is going to be a little bit underwhelming? Sure, I'll take him as a number 30 running back. And I'll respect the fact that he's going to get touches and could score. But ultimately, the upside is capped because Pittsburgh is a really good run-stopping defense. And that's why we have Alex Collins at number 30 until otherwise noted. Latavius Murray is at number 31, mainly because I don't know what this backfield is. They're on and off every other week. The inefficiencies of running the ball have just been insane. Despite playing against the Los Angeles Chargers, literally the second best matchup on the season. I mean, Gibby week 1, 90. Zeke in week 2 went for 71 and a touchdown, with Pollard going for 109 and a touchdown. CEH went for 100 against them. Hunt and Chubb this last week went for a combined total of 220 rushing yards. I mean, and 3 touchdowns on the ground. What are we talking about? Latavius Murray should have a good week, but the Ravens are just not it right now. They lost an offensive lineman, and I don't know what that offense looks like. I understand, respectively, the Indianapolis Colts are a better run-stopping defense than the Chargers, and Latavius Murray probably scores 10 points this week, but that's pretty much where he's capped at. And if he doesn't score that touchdown and Lamar pulls it or sends it to Mark Andrews or the Marquise Brown, then Latavius Murray is nothing but a couple carries and a couple peanuts and really an underwhelming performance in a very lackluster backfield. Jamaal Williams is at number 32. Jamaal Williams, another one of these running backs that if he scores a touchdown, he's in the RB2 category. As of late, has been around this like 7-8 fantasy point per game, conversation against the Cincinnati Bengals. I'm in on it. I'm ready. I think there's a very good chance that as a flex play, could end up scoring a touchdown this week and being a decent fantasy point producer. A.J. Dillon is our next prospect as our number 33. Like I mentioned in regards to Aaron Jones, as long as A.J. Dillon's getting more and more touches, it is going to be a problem for Aaron Jones because A.J. Dillon, he can get the work through the air because he's pretty much filling into the guy I just prior mentioned, Jamaal Williams' work from last year. But ultimately, A.J. Dillon is a power back. If they're leading the game, they're not going to use Aaron Jones to kill clock. Of course, he will get touchdowns, or he will get touches in the second half, and he'll get his touchdowns. But if in fact we're going to dedicate 15 touches to A.J. Dillon in a given week, it's going to hurt the upside of another running back. But when you're talking about an offense that is as effective as they've been in terms of running the ball, passing the ball, A.J. Dillon always has the upside, and that is why we have him at 33. 34 is Sony Michel, coming off a week in which he had 11 carries for 37 yards and a touchdown. There was just an entire period in which, in a singular drive, they ran the ball every single time with Sony Michel. They made it a dedicated experience to just pound the rock. And if this team wants to continue to do that, they can absolutely succeed in doing so, specifically against the New York Giants. So, without a doubt in my mind, again, with so many bye weeks, we have to mention some of these guys that are probably usually not weekly starts, but nonetheless, if you're given an opportunity, we respect it. Devin Singletary is at number 35. Speaking of opportunities, kind of disappeared for him. Zack Moss has really established himself as the RB1. And with that said, there's always a week in which Singletary comes out of nowhere, takes 70 rushing yards on 11 carries, scores a rushing touchdown, and then, he ruins the Zack Moss week. But nonetheless, of all the remaining running backs, when you're associated with such a powerful offense and most likely going to be leading in this game, Devin Singletary poses a lot of potential opportunity for upside. The last running back I wanted to mention is Khalil Herbert. Of all the remaining running backs that are out there, nobody else is probably going to get as many carries. Khalil Herbert could very easily fall into the end zone in terms of the running game, and though he wasn't given any targets, I'm very sure that he's probably capable of catching the ball out of this backfield and very easily filling into any role they want him to pretty much mold into. Regardless, those are my top 36 running back rankings in the week. Rankings are subject to change, but as they update throughout the week, we will have a live stream Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Do not forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel if you have not already, and of course, sign up with Underdog Fantasy, promo code Andrew, link down below. With your first deposit of $10 or more, you'll of course be given an additional $10 of bonus cash so you can play with, whether it is the Thursday night matchup, pick'ems, all of that kind of jazz. Thank you everybody for watching. I appreciate your support, and until tomorrow where we talk about the wide receiver position, good luck with waivers, and I'll see you guys. Peace.